making a few videos recently dedicated to knocking back YouTube channels using atheistic. But if I were to identify one problem that makes my job of smoothing the ground harder, or at least harder than it needs to be, it's not actually atheists that's the problem, specifically the denouncers. Don't get me wrong, they take the worst aspects of Christendom and blow them out of all proportions in order to push their own beliefs and confirm negative views of fellow non-believers. The problem is, it's based on some true aspects of the Christian faith that some people not only believe, but emphasize the point that they start to make a bad name for every religion, not just Christianity. I personally think the major issue in the church is fundamentalism. Why? Well, this is what I'm going to explain. Now, I originally thought, these people don't exist, and I'm pretty sure other people are like that as well. But when I was travelling in Australia, I ended up meeting some people, and I had dinner with a couple of them, and they spent a good portion of that dinner slagging off the Australian government for approving same-sex marriage, and refused to accept any idea of a metaphor in the creation story, insisting that the world was created literally in 7 days. Being raised in an open-minded household and a active church, with my grandmother being very active in the local interfaith group, I didn't have any rigid assumptions taken away by my schooling to other faiths and sciences. So I was shocked that two women of comparable age to my parents would be so intransigent to such a loose and easy worldview, regardless of how welcoming they were. The following Sunday, I invited a friend to that church, just because that's all I wanted to do. Just got a few people over. Only she came, but hey ho, wasn't complaining. Though she probably would, because the sermon was us being regaled by a homophobic tirade in the wake of the same-sex marriage legislation. She did not stick around after the service. She went back to the hostel pretty quickly, and I couldn't blame her. And I had to apologise for that tirade. I was not expecting it personally. But since then, I've been far more aware of the negative lean of some churches towards not only homosexuality, but the advantages in knowledge we have gained in the past centuries. But since this is a major problem for Christianity as a whole, I'm not just going to be drawing on what I know, but I've also drawn from sources such as Why We Must Say No to Fundamentalism by Martin Camroux and other interfaith works, left to me by my late grandmother. Whilst I'm defining fundamentalism as the belief that every word of the Bible is inerrant, so if you can find something anywhere in the Bible, you can be absolutely certain that it's right. I'm applying it as a catch-all for those churches that take the Bible too literally. It's worthwhile clarifying, however, that literalness isn't the true meaning in fundamentalist biblical views. Inerrancy doesn't mean literal, it means without error, which in this case means the Bible is the Word of God, therefore irrefutably true. This naturally implies that the Bible is complete and perfect, but just to start off with, my personal research establishes perfection was never part of creation. The biblical narrative focuses on one small area of the world The Bible itself isn't a good book by any common use of the word. This is something shared by many scholars as well, who tend to take the vast majority of the Bible as allegory or metaphor. Since this can drastically affect the way Christians are seen in secular society and gives religion as a whole a bad name, I am going to delve into those areas of contention that fundamentalists refuse to change their views on. I'm not here to hit on any particular denomination, but since I'm almost certain those elements I'm addressing aren't representative of every single church under the moniker, but some are going to be mentioned as examples of where certain things are witnessed, certainly by me and possibly by other people. Anyone from a mentioned denomination takes offence to that stereotyping and says it doesn't apply to their church, I apologise in advance. It's simply what I've witnessed, and what I've seen, it could be completely different from the way your church is. That being said, let us begin. According to the literal view of the Bible, the Earth is approximately 6,000 years old and was made around 4000 BC. This is drawn from the ages of the patriarchs and the dates of Christ's birth and his subsequent death on the cross. Due to the short amount of time this gives us for the Earth to be made, creation is only a reasonable way to think of how life came about. However, this gets debunked pretty quickly by two sections of the Bible. I know many atheists will be proud of me for saying this. But firstly, the first two chapters of Genesis, which is well understood by biblical scholars and skeptics who contradict each other. The first chapter describes the creation from nothing to everything in 6 days, each day getting certain things, separation from light and dark, the earth from the void, and so forth. However, the second chapter starts with the earth being made in just 1 day and the ground being dusty and lifeless. Later on, it says that Adam, or at least suggests that Adam, was not only the first man, but the first living creature to walk the earth. And that woman was made long after the other animals. This goes against the whole first chapter, and everything starts falling apart. You can't even say it's a clarification. I've done a video on that. Hopefully I'll remember to leave in a card above. But in my view, it's more a clarification of the fact the Bible is not well written. Quite possibly the first chapter wasn't meant to be the first chapter, the second book was. But there's clearly a heck of a lot of time between the first chapter and the second chapter. It's just written in a very poor way. Like I said, the Bible is not a good book. Second is a quote from the New Testament. Second book of Peter, chapter 3, verse 8. But do not forget this one thing, dear friends. The Lord, one day, is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. This shows that God doesn't work by our units of time, and therefore, what to him can be a day is to us a millennium. Now, you bear in mind that the likelihood of the biblical authors having a concept of anything greater than thousands, it could be that the time sense between us and God is far greater than it's implying, which isn't as significant as it is. There's quite possibly some little evidence of this in just the Roman number system. Whereas many people think that M is the Roman numeral for 1,000. exactly X, but the fact it's so rarely used shows they're not particularly interested in things that big. Granted, there may be thousands of individuals in their armies, but by that time they're breaking it down into not only cohorts, but centuries, legions, and so forth. So those legions can have set numbers, often the hundreds rather than thousands. All this fits into the evolution, because when we factor in a time disparity rivaling that of a Doctor Who story arc, we can see the time allows for evolution far more than the couple of thousand years that the Masoretic dates allow for. As to how it works, I am going to get into that since, well, it's been bugging me for a while and I need to let it out. It can be understood in two ways. Firstly, as building a Lego model. Individual bits make little sense, but as you start to put it together, the shape becomes obvious. It makes like an incoherent blob, and you may think, how is this meant to be that in the picture? But sooner or later, it builds up. And for those of you that say there's no evidence of this working in nature, I have one word for you: embryology. And if you don't want to bother looking that up, my advice is you need to watch a video on how babies are made. And I'm not talking about the action scene at the beginning. I'm talking about the bit in the middle that lasts 9 months. Get your head in gear, guys. Second is more about the evolution itself over time, how forms change. And that can be thought of like a game of Chinese whispers. You take DNA as the whisper. We've all played Chinese whispers before, and I've mentioned it more than a few times in my videos about biblical stories and oral traditions. But, like I said, if you take DNA, which has been around since the start of life as we understand it, that is a very long game, lasting hundreds of thousands of years, with a twist of adding things as it goes on, to clarify a little bit, or maybe just aiding little things. That is how you could say that, hang on, those little mistakes, how can that make things better? Those little changes happen over time in such subtle ways that people barely notice. I like thinking of it as a game of Chinese whispers because if you do it with individuals, so as tell them a whole story, they're either going to forget some things, make tiny little mistakes, then pass it on to someone else. And then that goes on. They might do it to someone else, again, slightly different. And that's how it branches out into many different forms. You see that a lot with Grimm's fairy tales and so forth. The original versions, I'm not entirely sure which ones they are, but they got the bones, but they don't bear any general commonality to others. There's so many different versions of those stories, and yet they're barely even commented on. Now, because this is such a subtle thing, the DNA is actually going to notice any big changes, as Frank Turek from Cross Examine, a Genesis apologetic, if I remember correctly, made a point that actually can be explained by that differences being obvious. Because if we try, say, making a fruit fly into a horsefly just by fiddling with the DNA, we can only have 3 outcomes, as he's explained, one of which is just a fruit fly, as we expect. The other is a mutant fly, which looks a lot like a fruit fly, but it's warped, it's not the same, it's not going to live very long. Or a dead fly, something that just doesn't work. How does this apply to my Chinese whispers thing? Again, applies as a story. And in fact, Mythology and Fiction Explained did a great video on something similar. This video was talking about the Coat, I think. I'll see if I can leave the link in the description. He basically said, if oral stories change over time, so original canon versions are harder to pin down. But if we were to take, say, an example of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, and we hear of a story where Harry is killing Dumbledore and then giving birth to house elves, anyone that knows the books will tell you that it's utter nonsense, and even those who haven't read the books or watched the movies but grew up in the time of the books and the movies when they were the big thing, they will sense something is off. They haven't heard anything about that, so clearly it's not right. Here we have three similar scenarios. Either they'll have the proper story, sort of saying, no, it's this, a warped version where it's like, well, I've heard Dumbledore gets killed later on. Perhaps that was by Harry, and well, Harry's bad to have house elves eventually. House elves were growing up with him, something like that. Or they think it's a bizarre story, I'm not having any of it. So they just won't bother. Like I said, in Grimm's fairy stories, subtle differences happen over time. So whilst there are notable differences, they're barely commented on anymore. I've never heard anyone saying, no, that version of Rumpelstiltskin is completely different from the one I grew up with. Or anyone mentions transition fossils, saying that there aren't enough transition fossils. Fossilization isn't a common thing, that just happens to every dying thing. There are certain circumstances that need to be allowed for, and it's quite likely many things are going to get destroyed before we actually find them. That happens quite a lot, particularly with our exploration to fossils, fuels. If someone's going to break, we're going to lose something. Quite frankly, it's amazing we can find fossils as it is, because it's the fossilization situation needs to be so precise, or at least so many factors need to be accounted for, that if we found any is a good indication that a life exists and there are transitional fossils somewhere. We just need to find them. It takes time. Yes, we've been looking for about 150 years. We got a lot more history to go for, and we're just digging away. Give it time. We haven't even explored all the oceans yet, so not deep down. There are definitely far more arguments that apologetics could be using, but I'm not going to delve into them because this is going to be a fairly long video as it is, and I've got the other factors to consider. Being almost synonymous with fundamental churches, hatred of the LGBTQ community is rife in fundamentalist communities. I've come across at least 3 different churches with very strong homophobia. They all give the classic arguments: it's not Adam and Steve, it's unnatural, it's morally wrong, it offends God, and all the arguments have hashed over so many times that I can't go into them here. I've already done at least 4 videos. Ironically, I call them the big 3. So for those of you interested, I'm definitely going to link the playlist in the card, or at the very least in the description. But to sum up, you can basically consider it in 3 points. Homosexuality is a problem. The solution is same-sex marriage. And God wants us to be honest and open about who we are and what we are. Hiding what we are is more offensive to him than joining the marches. So, those of you that are afraid of it, get on your rainbow shirt and get out there, my friends. Like I said, follow the link in the description. Either that or in the card. I said it once, and I'll say it again. The Bible isn't a good book for all manner of reasons. But apart from one person calling it a fictional book, which was a complete misunderstanding on their part of the term fictional, its level of accuracy in terms of general late Mesopotamian history is fairly close, actually. However, to insist that literally everything in the Bible is inerrant and therefore unquestionable is completely unreasonable. I've said it many times in my Genesis study, which I probably won't be continuing into Exodus. There's way too much going on here. And quite frankly, Exodus starts going into far more concrete things rather than speculation, like I've done in Genesis. The mixture of oral stories, prophecies, visions, and so forth, sooner or later, it's going to be an error somewhere, and there are some things just stand as, hang on, that makes no sense, we need clarifying. To say that is literally how it is just makes no sense at all. Plus, since many people say that it's the only truth, and it only covers a small geographical region, wouldn't that disprove many great things, including Genghis Khan, all the Americas, much of Europe, and Stonehenge? Come now, yes, this is an exaggeration, but it does raise a point. It's highlighted in the Bible, in two separate cases in Proverbs. Chapter 14, verse 15 says, "The simple believes every word, but the prudent man considers well his steps." And later on, in verse 18, it says, "The simple inherit folly, but the prudent are crowned with knowledge." Prudence means to be cautious and wise, in the general definition. A biblical definition being virtuous capacity to regulate in a convenient and orderly manner the actions to reach an established end. In short, believing literally everything without question is foolish, to say the least. Being able to question and understand the ways of God is the whole point of learning about it. If we don't give ourselves a chance to question Him, how do we get answers? Since the Bible has minor contradictions early on, which are major when taken literally, in order to understand it, you need to ask questions. That is learning for you. We look at something, we ask questions about it, we learn different things about it. I've heard many people talking about the end times like it's a near thing, like we're living in them. Like sooner or later, people are going to get called to heaven or so forth. I've heard some people say that it's only the Catholics that will be called to heaven, which, as a Church of England man, is slightly worrying. And 3 times, well, at least twice actually, in the past 10 years, people have said, "Oh, that's the apocalypse coming." Someone's Catholic, or the Mayans predicted, something like that, and well, still here. I've never studied Revelation overly much, to be honest, but if I am to guess, it's likely this is where the Bible doesn't give accurate dates. So, understanding the signs is harder to interpret. This means that human understanding has to play a role. So, even if the Bible itself is inerrant, humans are fundamentally flawed, so we can't be the judge of the signs. I often said the signs are only signs when the thing they are being significant for has already occurred. I don't personally like prophecies, and I hold very little store by prophets for that reason. So I don't really focus on the end times. Most people, I think it's better to live in the moment than expect the future to pan out in the same way we expect it to. Life is just too complicated for that. I do have certain theories that will require me to delve into Revelations and other tie-in scriptures. Until then, one thing I want to mention is the concept of the limited number of people following Christ. I think there's something like 11,000, people say. Let's delve into that at some point. However, that is simply being used to drive a wedge between those who would otherwise be loving, caring neighbours. Those are some of the things that fundamentalists do. There's one chap on YouTube who's a Seventh-day Adventist who says there's a limited number of spaces in that number. That is true, but with that in mind, surely we should be focusing on what we're doing for people rather than to people. Are we following God's law or persecuting people constantly? Christ said that we should love one another as he loved us, and by that shall all know who his disciples are. Christ didn't change the law, but he did emphasize the parts that people were neglecting at the time, namely loving people. Seventh-day Adventists may accept God, may accept Jesus as their Messiah, but are they accepting his law? The law that he's actually outlining, from the law they say he's not refuting. That is a general overview of what I happen to find about fundamentalism. Doubtless there's far more I've yet to cover, but I can't pretend that this is all down to their beliefs alone. That makes these people hard to reconcile with. In some cases, it's simply their evangelistic, holier than thou, get behind me, foul creature attitude that makes them so much harder to be around as people. I'm deeply Christian, as I said many times before, and yet not only to allow people of a faith, but also friends that have turned away from God. A friend of mine actually quotes the Silmarillion whenever I quote the Bible to him, which is interesting. Another friend just refuses to accept any of it, and I don't care. They're my friends, I love them. I don't bang on about it. But it's this toxic attitude that's common amongst fundamentalists, coupled with a less than progressive position on women's places in life, and the openness of the church as a whole, that by common wisdom is actively discouraged and advised not to be associated with. No wonder, really, that the three atheists whose stories of deconversion I've heard of in full, they all came from fundamentalist families. One from a family that was involved in essential oils, one from Jehovah's Witnesses, the other, granted, I haven't delved into the story yet, I'll probably do so later on, but his mother was also narcissistic, so that could have been a contributing factor. On Judge's stage, I haven't done a full review. But they're all from fundamentalist families. The two mainstream atheists I've already covered on this channel, namely Friendly Atheist and Rationality Rules, who, by my understanding, have never been religiously inclined, and so have an outside perspective. Most likely have seen this fundamentalist approach as the de facto state of Christendom, and therefore have geared their general modus operandi towards thumping down this belief. With fundamentalists being the way they are, I can't blame anyone else for doing this. Though I am trying to reduce the knock-on effect of this on more secular branches of Christianity. I know someone's going to mention that I use grand words like de facto or modus operandi. I'm not Charles Prentice. It's just words that happened to come to mind when I was writing out the script. Don't judge me for that. In short, there's so much that fundamentalism is just ignoring in favour of trusting a book that, for the majority of history, has been taken not, if not as allegory, then at least as internally flawed. There's no denying that science doesn't have all the answers, but neither does the Bible. Yes, there are concepts that seem to be taken from the Bible, like morality, like people noticing that this is so set up that something must have tweaked it in some way. That things seem to happen for a reason, or at least have some bearing on what we want. Not always, but still. But regardless of how you view the scriptures, there's far more to the world than the Bible allows for. Remember, the book is of the world. The world isn't of the book. Not even all the books in the world can contain everything. This is why we should say no to fundamentalism. And yes, to a more open, secular way of thinking and of living. If we are to worship God fully, it is not by burying our heads in a book. I may well be delving into some religious channels that do talk about these sort of topics. So keep an eye out for that in the future. But until then, my friends, stay safe and God be with you.